Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Katie Hotham, the Program Assistant for Nebraska Women in Agriculture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Women in Ag is excited to partner with the Center for Agricultural Profitability's webinar series, which typically takes place every Thursday at noon Central Time. You can see the upcoming schedule of webinars and find an archive of past recordings at cap.unl.edu. Today is the first in a series of webinars that we'll be doing featuring speakers and presenters from this year's Nebraska Women in Agriculture Conference held back in February. For the latest news and upcoming events from Women in Ag, please check out our website at wia.unl.edu. This session, called Fire Up Your Farm and Family Finances, will offer actionable steps to empower you to build a better financial future for your farm and your family. We are glad to be joined by Paul Stoddard, a senior lecturer at the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Paul joined the University of Illinois full-time in 2012, following a 30-year career in agricultural real estate, commodity trading, farm management, and agricultural lending. He spent 14 years with Farm Credit Illinois, most recently serving as chief appraiser. In addition to his academic duties, Paul operates a consulting, brokerage, management, and appraisal business specializing in agricultural real estate. Hi, Paul, and thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon. I started to say good morning, but it's afternoon already. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I will go quickly because that's my nature. And I've got a lot to talk about in the next hour. I will try to get done with enough time at the end that you could ask questions if you like. And if we don't have time to do that, or we have additional questions, you're always welcome to email me, and I'll provide my email address at the end. Also, I'd like you to know that this presentation will be available to you, the same PowerPoint, and always happy to answer follow-up questions in the future if you have any then as well. It's good to be here. I appreciate this opportunity. It was a great privilege and a lot of fun to be part of the Nebraska Women in Agriculture in-person conference in Kearney back in February, when the weather was decidedly different than it was now. And I appreciate having this opportunity to speak to you again. I'm going to offer 10 action items today. They're numbered, and you'll be able to keep track of them as we go. These are things that you would be able to do, actionable items that you can do to improve the financial situation in the present and future for your family and for your farm operations. Number one, and this is a difficult one, especially within the rural community, you got to make them share the financial records. And by that, I mean the old people. And I say that as one of the old people. I'll be 66 in about 10 days, so I'm no longer part of the younger group. But I think it's really important and pivotal to the future of your operation that you financially educate the younger generation, whether they be 50, 40, 30, or 20. And this is a little bit difficult in the rural culture because often we keep numbers to ourselves and don't share things. But it's terribly important that the younger generation understands that farming is more than just the operation side. Operations are very important, very difficult, very complex, very time consuming, but also they need to understand the financial side of the business and things like ownership structure, banking arrangements, leases, cash flow statements, balance sheet, networks, etc. Those all have a huge impact. And next, number two, don't scare your accountant. You need to know your farm and family living, your farm expenses and your family living expenses on an ongoing basis. And where this comes about and why I phrase it this way, I'm friends with somebody who used to be the president of the Illinois Farm Business Farm Management Service, which is very much like Nebraska Farm Business Incorporated that you may be familiar with. This person is also enrolled agents, still works with cooperators, had just gotten done doing a farm family's tax return. And I happened to have a hallway conversation here on the 4th floor of Mumford Hall on the University of Illinois campus. And he told me that at the end of their meeting, as he was going through the prior year's numbers with this farmer said to my friend Dwight, "Wow, did we spend that much on family living?" And I said to Dwight, "Does it scare you that farmer learned how much they spent in family living last year from you today?" And Dwight's response was, "Paul, it scares me to death. That's the type of operation I'm afraid won't be here in 10 years. You absolutely have to know your expenses, and you not only have to know them, you have to know them in real time on an ongoing basis. And not hard to do, easy to do with a lot of common apps. As an example of this, partly because of that story and partly because I teach personal finance and I'm always nagging college age individuals about the importance of having a budget, I've started doing what I preach and keep very close tracks of grocery expenditures. We all hear about food price inflation. My actual experience was, yes, in 2022, my average grocery bill in January and February was 21.3% higher than it was earlier. But one of those advantages of actually paying attention to the actual numbers, what I found the following year, that my grocery expenses had gone down almost as much as they had come back up. Number 3, golden eras don't last. I think this is especially important for farmers to consider right now. I think we're at an inflection point in the agricultural economy. We come out of 3 years that were very good in varying degrees in varying parts of the countries, of course. But it's important, and I had the perspective of a 66-year-old. Throughout my career, we get good years and we get some bad years too. And so it's important to manage your finances and with the expectation that things can go the other way, whether we're in a good period or whether we're in a bad period. And we've certainly had great periods. We had a good commodity super cycle, that kind of 2008 to 2012. We had several good years that were good, partly because of a combination of grain prices, government payments, et cetera. And it's important to keep these in mind. This is likely to change, is the best thing to keep in mind. And also, I like to point out something that my friend, Dr. David Cole, who some of you may have heard, likes to point out to his farm groups that he speaks to, which is that it's not the things you do during the bad times that get you in trouble in terms of your farm finances. It's the things that you do during the good times. So it's really important to realize that good times don't last. And at the same time, I'd be the first person to point out that bad times don't last either. So it's easy to get discouraged if we have 2-3 years of low commodity prices, like it looks like we're heading into now. When I look at what the price of grain has done in the last 6 weeks alone, it's enough to make me a little bit nervous about things, especially because some of us ended up paying fairly high, locking in, including me, myself, locking in at fairly high input prices last fall. Seemed like the right thing to do. I paid $11.10 per ton for ammonia that now could be bought for about $7.50 around here. Number 4, financial planning is a lifelong process. It isn't difficult. It isn't terribly time consuming, but it is a process, and it's something that needs to be revisited from time to time. Maybe 2 or 3 times per year, you sit down and look at things again would be a very helpful activity. And it's also important that there need to be other people involved. I'll talk at the end of this presentation about building a team and whom you might want to have on that team to ensure your success. But your financial planning would include consultations with legal and accounting professionals as well, and maybe a financial planner. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, to how you might think about whether you need a financial planner and what the different types of planners are based on how they charge. And we're here there already. There are 3 main types of financial planners, and the names are confusing. If I was to be cynical, I might suppose that the names are intentionally confusing. One is fee only. That's what it sounds like. The second category is fee-based, and that's where they receive fees from you, the individual who's gone to procure their services, but also they receive some commission. And then the third, the commission-based, very often affiliated with insurance companies. And it's important that you understand the differences. I personally would tend to favor the fee only, because you know what you're paying for, and they don't have a financial incentive to steer you into one product or another that might be something that generates them a commission. And then also it's important to realize that in some cases they'll have minimum levels of assets that they might want you to have before they're willing to work with you. And some financial planners that I have talked to also would require three things from an individual or family that wanted to work with them. First of all, that you have all credit card debt paid off. Second, that you have health insurance. And third, that you have some kind of emergency funds established. And the idea there is that you have not done those 3 things. Those should be your one and only focus until you accomplish those 3 things before you move on to more sophisticated levels of financial and tax planning. And I think it's also extremely important, we're already up to number 5, that you learn to prepare and use what are referred to as the 3 outputs of financial accounting. The balance sheet, which is simply a statement of everything owned and everything owed. In other words, if you were to sell out your business, what would be left over? And bankers are interested in that, but you should be as well too. And then also we can take that to a little higher sophistication, look at some ratios within that. Second is the income statement, which is the only way that you really know if you're making money or not. And that uses a variety of things, including both cash expenses as well as non-cash expenses. depreciation being the large non-cash expense that sometimes doesn't get properly recognized. And then the cash flow statement, which is a schedule, often broken down by months or maybe even in smaller increments, if you like, of all money in and all money out. And that doesn't just include farm revenue, but will include non-farm items as well. So things like family living as an expenditure, off-farm income as an income item. But you need to be able to understand these and use these in real time, not just at the end of the year and not just for borrowing purposes. Most people, including me, have to do those at year end for tax purposes. Some cases, people are doing that for borrowing purposes, but it's worth your time to take it to a higher level, have a greater level of sophistication, and be able to use benchmarking. And that's one thing where Nebraska Farm Business Incorporated can come in very handy. They can provide you with metrics that show how you're doing. So maybe your herbicide costs, maybe your machine costs, maybe your depreciation costs, for example. Very often farmers don't really know how those costs compare to other farms because you probably don't share your financials with your neighbors and nobody really knows what other people are paying or receiving. So just if nothing else, it's a great way for you to know the answer to that important question, which is, how am I doing? And you can hit an easy button on all this, what Nebraska Farm Business will do and what FBFM here in Illinois will do. If you want to make this easier, you would enter into an arrangement with them where your bank would send duplicates of your checking statements to them every month. And then you enter a numeric code on every deposit slip that tells them what the money is being received for, and on every check written that tells them what the money is being spent for. And they can automate all this. They can make this really easy for you. And if you don't like doing it, this is a great solution. Maybe you're a number cruncher at heart. Maybe you enjoy spreadsheets. Maybe you think this is a lot of fun. I'm a little bit of a number nerd myself. And if so, I would understand that. But if this is something you don't like doing, get somebody else to do it. Just like changing the oil in your pickup. It's got to be done. Doesn't mean you have to be the one to do it. Number 6, you must have life insurance if you have dependents. Enormously important. I continue to hear stories from time to time of somebody who has a need for life insurance, didn't have any life insurance, and these can be really tragic. But I'm going to tell you a story just like that from my own personal experience not too long ago. But you've got to think about who depends on you financially, who would be financially injured or set back if you were no longer among the living. And it's important there to think about who are your dependents. So if we think of the life cycle that somebody goes through, when somebody first marries or enters into any kind of long-term committed relationship, very often their partner becomes a financial dependent. So if two people in their 20s buy a house together, if either of those persons were to unfortunately decease, the other person would all of a sudden be looking at a house payment that's probably more than what they had intended to fund with their own money alone. And then as you go later in life, one thing that surprises people is often sometimes later in life, people my age or older end up having parents who may be financially dependent on them. And also maybe a disabled adult, but just think about who depends on you in a financial sense. One of the best ways to address that is term insurance. Term insurance is really simple, really straightforward. And of the various insurances that are available to you, it's my favorite. You only get one thing. All you're doing is buying a death benefit. If the person named on the policy passes away, the people named as beneficiaries receive however many dollars is the face value of that policy. The reason they call it term is that you can't own it for your whole life. And very often term policies, as you go through life and get older, and I've experienced it myself as I get older, the cost of my term insurance goes up every year. And then there may come a point where they won't sell it to you anymore. In my case, for the policies I still have, even though I don't need them, but at my age, I continue to keep them because they're inexpensive and affordable for me. But when I get to age 80, they won't insure me anymore. And that's why they call it term insurance. It's important to think about who you want to designate as your beneficiaries. And that should be done with legal counsel and accountants as well. But the great advantage of term insurance is much, much, much cheaper than the alternative, the principal alternative being whole life policies. And very often the whole life policy will cost someplace between 10 and 20 times as much per month. And so in many cases, just simply isn't affordable. It's cheap. That's the other great thing about it. And particularly if you're young And the good news about cheap insurance, I always try to teach my students, you should always be happy when you see that there's a low cost for insurance, because what that tells you, if term insurance is cheap for you, the life insurance company doesn't think it's very likely that you're going to pass away. So they're willing to take on that risk for a very small premium. And then sometimes people say, well, you know, what happens if I don't use it? I pay into it all this year, I don't have anything left. Actually, who might be saying that to you is the person who's trying to sell you a whole life policy. Well, if I get to age 80 and haven't used all this term insurance that I've got, you know what I'll say? I'll say, yeehaw, I made it to 80 and I didn't die. So that it's like other types of insurance. I hope I make it through the day without using the insurance on my 2014 F-150. And I hope I make it through the day without using my medical insurance. And most of all, I hope I make it through the day without using my life insurance. So we buy insurance for things that have a low probability of occurring, but a potentially catastrophic cost if they do occur. What about whole life? The alternative to term life is whole life. And with whole life, you're actually getting two things. And I don't know why, but I've always thought of this in terms of a farmer holding two barrels. And one of the things that you could get is the death benefit. And the other component with whole life, which term life doesn't have, is the so-called cash value. But the problem with that, and what often people don't realize, and I think very few people realize this until they get in the position of finding out the hard way, so to speak, is that you can never get your hand on both barrels. So with a whole life policy, if somebody doesn't touch the cash value, lets that accumulate, passes away, their family gets the death benefit. In that case, they got the death benefit, they didn't get the cash value. Where'd the cash value go? On the other hand, while they're living, if they take that cash value out and then they pass away, the death benefit is reduced by the amount of the cash value. So where did the other part of the death benefit go? And you never get your hands on both of those. You can have it forever, and I'm not saying it's a totally bad idea. And sometimes for estate planning, for example, somebody might want a policy that would last for their entire life, no matter how long they live. So if you hear of somebody who died at age 97 and left insurance money to their heirs, then that means they had a whole life policy, not a term policy. But it tends to be enormously expensive, costs much, much more. And that often makes it prohibitive or a less than optimal alternative. You could take the money that you would save. So if you compare the whole life premium, the term premium, you could take that extra money, invest it yourself, have control over it, end up with more money, and have a better outcome in some cases. So what the person trying to sell whole life insurance often says, well, that cash value, you're building your own bank. And what the wise men, my friend, we've got several CPAs on staff here in our faculty, and we have a big financial planning curriculum here, says, instead of building your own bank in the form of cash value life insurance, open a Roth IRA, grows tax-free, you have complete control, also acts like a bank, great place to have an emergency fund, and lots of other attributes. I want to tell you a brief story that this is true, and something that happened in my life that's made a huge impression on me and causes me to want to talk to people about the importance of life insurance and the importance of understanding the difference between whole and term. A young couple moved to our little county seat farm town a few years ago and opened a small shop, and they did car repairs and oil changes and sold tires and that kind of thing. And they were good people. I got to know them. A little rough around the edges. Steve had tattoos that began at his fingernails and went all the way up to his earlobes. And I was kind of proud that our small town, which isn't always welcoming as some places might be, welcomed him with open arms, because he was darn good mechanic and darn good person as well. Steve and Kristen had a young child, and they were getting their business started and kind of starting to make things work. One day I was in their shop and they happened to ask some advice because they knew I do ag real estate appraisals on the side. They had some appraisal related questions because the owner of the building they were in had talked about raising the rent, and they were actually looking at buying their own business. And in the course of conversation, I found out that they were about to borrow $200,000 to buy a new facility in which to have their automobile repair and tire shop. They did that. They made the deal, moved, planned their move to occur over the Christmas break. So they were going to shut down just before Christmas, do all the move, open up right after January holidays were over, or the New Year holiday. And they had gotten almost done. They had everything moved. They've been working, they and their employees Had 3 or 4 mechanics working for him, had been working day and night to get this move accomplished. And they were just about there. In fact, the day before they were open, it was about 7 o'clock at night. They were still at work, and Steve didn't feel very good. They had a little lounge area where you get a pop machine and a place to sit down while you're waiting for your oil change, your tires to be put on. And Steve went to the lounge area and laid down on the couch and died. To everyone's great shock. And I went to the visitation a little bit later, and Kristen told me with tears in her eyes that she was bound and determined to keep that business going. She said that business was Steve and my dream, and we're going to make this work. And I thought that was pretty cool. And so she did. The shop went ahead and opened, and they moved forward. And about 6 weeks later, I was in there to get an oil change on my wife's vehicle, I think, and asked Kristen how it was going. And she got tears in her eyes and said, not very good. She said, I'm $200,000 in debt, and I didn't just lose my best friend and my husband. I also lost my best mechanic. And Paul, we didn't have life insurance. And she said, guy had come talk to us several times, and we just never pulled the trigger and did it. And I didn't know them real well, but I knew them well enough to be completely puzzled by that. I knew a little bit about how they lived. I drove by their house every day on my way to work, and they lived in a decent house, and they drove decent vehicles, and looked like their business was making some money. There were always customers around when I was there. And I could not for the life of me figure out why in the world they wouldn't have bought life insurance, because term insurance is so cheap. And then actually, while I was teaching a personal finance lecture on exactly this, I'm standing in front of a room full of students, and the light went off. A little light bulb in my head when I finally figured something out. I realized that the person who had come to see Steve and Kristen was trying to sell them a whole life policy. And that was too much and too expensive, and that's why they didn't do it. And so I went and looked online, and they are both around 30 years old at this time. For Steve, a male 30-year-old at that point in time, they could have bought a $1 million term life policy for $59.75 a month, and for $54.75. And for Christian, 30-year-old female, they could have bought a $1 million policy for $44.92 per month. In other words, for $99.67. It's around that, us often call that $100 a month. They could have bought policies that would have given either person, if they survived, $1 million. With $1 million, Kristen could have paid off the business and operated it. With $1 million, she could have paid off the business, sold it, gone and done something else. So then I thought, well, I wonder why they didn't do it. And since I knew what term was, I looked at the price of whole life insurance. Whole life, the same 2 policies on the same 2 people would have cost $1,463 a month. That's why they didn't do it. They didn't have $1,463 a month. They could have come up with $100 a month, skip one night out, and they would have had that kind of money. So Kristen's business closed and sold about a year later, and the sale was a bankruptcy auction. And I think that illustrates pretty well the importance of having insurance coverage. How much do you need? This is something that needs to be thought out on an ongoing basis. This is something that changes over time. You need enough money that the surviving family member can get the kids to adulthood and take care of whatever expenses they need. So that's going to change over time. And it's important to note that often people would have multiple term policies. So when 2 people get married or form whatever type of union, they buy insurance on each other. Maybe they buy a house, they might buy a policy that would be enough to pay off the house for the survivor. Kid comes along, add some term insurance. Second kid comes along, add some term insurance. And then at some point, as the kids gets older, you can start to drop those off. So if you have very often a 60-year-old person like me doesn't have any need for life insurance anymore. I don't have dependent children. I do have life insurance because I get a term policy through the university that's incredibly cheap and would be quick, fast cash for my surviving spouse if ever needed that. But so this is something that would be different across time, and you would work this out. And an accountant or attorney would be good to get advice on that. Number 7, today is the day to beginning planning for retirement, regardless of what age you are right now. Whether you're 20 or 40 or 60 or 70 years old, if you haven't begun planning for retirement, today is an excellent day to do that. And it actually can be pretty simple. Stanford University did a big study, compared 275 different possible retirement strategies, and the one that they said best is remarkably simple. It only has 2 pieces, and each of these pieces would be doable by anybody. Number 1, don't take Social Security until you're 70 years old. And it's a wonderful generator of income in retirement. It lasts as long as you do. Unlike some things, it protects against inflation. It gets adjusted upwards. My wife is 12 years older than me, so she's been on Social Security for a while. She got an 8.9% raise beginning in January. It's unrelated to the stock market, so you do want that. Certainly having some exposure to the stock market over long periods of time, especially if you're young, is a very good strategy, but you don't want to tie everything to that. It direct deposits into your checking account. You don't have to do anything. And depending on the rest of your financial situation, it may not be taxable, or part of it isn't taxable, and that depends on what else you have. If you haven't done so, I strongly encourage you to go online, go to the address you see here, go to the Social Security Administration site, and create a username and password, and you can see the income history they have on you, and you can see what they will pay you. This is an example of mine I pulled a few years ago, shows what you would get at different ages, what would be available to survivors in certain circumstances, etc. But it's enormously important that you put a number on that so that you know what else you might need. In general, Social Security is probably not sufficient in most cases as a retirement source of income, but it is an important part of your total package and will be a big contributor. You hear a lot in the press about the worries about Social Security, whether it will be around. I think it'll be around. I think that resolving some of those issues probably won't happen politically in the next few years, but as we get closer to that, and particularly, and I'm a boomer, I can say this, as the boomers die off, this gets politically easier for Congress to make those more difficult decisions. In many cases, you just have to tell everybody, sorry, we blew it on the math. We're going to have to pay everybody 95% of what we promised. And a couple of small changes like that, changing the age at which you can retire, would resolve most of the issues with Social Security. The second part of what Stanford said was the best option is put your retirement money into low-cost index funds. And those are a great way to save, and the low-cost part of that is really important. And index funds are different than mutual funds. They are conceptually similar in that in both cases, somebody is buying stock in a large basket of companies so that you don't have that concentration, the risk that goes with concentration if you try to pick individual stocks. So for example, if you were to buy into an S&P 500 index fund, which you could do through Vanguard or TD Ameritrade or any one of a number of similar companies that offer that kind of thing, you're buying a piece of an entity, and that entity owns the 500 stocks that are in that index. And occasionally the S&P company takes a stock out or puts one in, they make those adjustments, but they're not making any investment decisions on your behalf. They're just maintaining that. So their only job is really an accounting function, and that's why the fees that they charge are so much less. And that makes a big difference over long periods of time. If you don't want to, if you don't even want to be as specific as that, they also have target date funds, and you would choose one that matches the year when you expect to retire. So somebody graduating from college now might look at a 2050 fund, and in that they would use index funds. They would shift from a heavier percentage of stock market exposure when you're young to a greater bond portfolio as you're older, and all that gets automated, all that gets taken care of for you, and makes a great easy choice. The money that you put in is protected from taxes, so it's tax-free going in, but when it comes out, then it gets taxed, and the government is only willing to wait so long for that to happen. So they require you at age 72 to begin to take money out. You don't have to spend it. You could just take it out, pay taxes on it, and then save it or invest it however you want. And they will calculate that for you. They'll automatically deposit for you. They will haul taxes for you. And so it's pretty much seamless, just like that Social Security check would be. So you'd have 2 automatic paychecks coming in, and that make things pretty simple and straightforward. It varies a lot, but it varies based on a formula that changes each year. It has to actually do with life expectancy of people at that age. But right now it's around 3.65% would have to come out every year. So you have, as an individual, you have, some of you may have access to retirement funds through work. And in many cases, those are a very good option. If you're doing this independently, you could consider a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, and there are also self-directed 401ks. You would need the advice and help of a CPA or somebody like that to set those up. But those are great ways to retire, great ways to save for retirement, and some have huge tax advantages, in particularly the Roth IRA. There is an income limit, so this is usually something somebody would do when they're younger, because there will come a point in your life where you're making too much money and you can't open one. But the Roth is great because you put in after-tax dollars, and then the earnings on that money, as long as you wait until after you're 59 and a half and the money's been in more than 5.5 years, the earnings are tax-free. And that is huge. There are very few ways to get money tax-free. In fact, that's such a good benefit. I am wondering if at some point Congress won't be tempted to take that away. But so a great way to do that, and very worthwhile to do that fairly early. And the advantage of the Roth too, you could use it as an emergency fund. So money in a Roth, if you take money out that you put in, it was taxed on the way in, so it's already been taxed. If you take it out early, you just pay tax on it, and you don't have the penalty that would be associated with a 401k. How much you need to retire? It depends on how you plan to approach this. There are kind of two ways to do it. And whether you intend to just live on the income from your retirement funds, which would be wonderful because you then would have a large nest egg to leave to your heirs. And you might also think in terms of, well, I'm just going to spend it down as long as I'm sure that I have some left at the end. You may have heard people talk about the 4% rule. There, and particularly prior to the so-called Great Recession of 2008-9, people often talked about the 4% rule, which was that if you took out 4% of your stock market holdings every year, you could probably do that in perpetuity. So since the Great Depression, it's calculated that the stock market has, depending on who you listen to, generally returned around 8 or 9%. Tends to be very variable, wide swings. So some years much better, some years much worse, but all in all average that 4% would work. If you wanted to be more conservative, you would plan to take out less. And one metric people might use for that is the T-bill rate, which today is about 3.55%, would make your money last a little bit longer. I also want to mention, especially for this audience, I think it's really important that as I think about farmland in terms of my total asset allocation, related both to my investment allocation while I'm alive and my eventual estate, I think of farmland in the same way I think of bonds. So bonds, in contrast to stock, tend to be very stable. They tend to be relatively low rate of return compared to the stock market. So they're safer. Farmland is very similar in those respects. So as I think about my ownership, so at my age, almost 66, I should be shifting more into bonds and less out of stocks. And in my case, I have some farmland ownership. And so therefore, my liquid cash, I keep that fairly heavily concentrated in the equities market or the stock market. The thing that makes such a big difference, and to the younger people in the audience, I salute you. You have a tremendous advantage that I don't have, because time makes a huge difference. The earlier you can start, the better you are. This graph shows if you invested $1 at different ages. So on the left, if you invested at 20 years old, or on the right at 65 years old. And you can see there's a great difference in what that dollar would turn into by age 65. So that's because I described stock market returns in that 8 or 9% range. According to the Motley Fool, for the last 150 years, the S&P 500 index has averaged a return that is the sum of 6.6% plus whatever the rate of inflation was in that year. And so that's how we get to that total return in that 8 or 9, or some people even say 10%. And during that time, there have been all kinds of things that have gone on. I don't need to read these to you, but the point is that very often we tend to be shy about investing money. If you're really investing for the long run, especially if you're younger, you have time to recover. So my granddaughter, for example, graduated from college recently, works in HR in Boeing in the St. Louis area. She's not even 30 years old yet. If the stock market goes down, her monthly investment from her paycheck will actually buy more shares at a lower price than if the price was high. So actually, for Sydney's sake, if the stock market were to stay down for another 5 or 10 years and then have a big recovery, that would be a better outcome. So if we look at somebody who's 32 years old, if they invest $1 today, by age 65, it'll be worth about $8.50. For me, I'm sad to say, on the other hand, at 65, if I am 65 for the next 3 weeks, if I invest $1, it'll be worth $1 when I'm 65. So I do something with my students and actually make them do the math, but I look at differences in outcomes and look at different possibilities. We assume that we've got 5 different people. They all have a starting salary of $50,000. We assume they're all going to start investing at age 23 after they graduate. We assume they're all going to work until they're 70 years old. And we assume that they have 2 choices in how they invest. They can invest more aggressively, more in the stock market and earn 8%, or more conservatively in a bond portfolio and earn 4%. We also look at differences on whether they start saving for retirement immediately at age 23 or wait 20 years and start at age 43, trying to catch up later, and see what would happen. And we assume no inflation, but we also assume they don't give any raises. So the numbers that I'm going to show you, you could think of in terms of current dollars. Could you live on this amount of money today? And so we have several of them. We have that person who invests aggressively right off the bat until they're age 43 and then stops adding money. Maybe at age 43, they have quadruplets, life gets expensive, they decide they can't afford to invest anymore. We look at somebody who starts late and doesn't get around to starting until they're about 43 and then is trying to play catch up, so to speak. We look at somebody who starts at age 23, like is commonly suggested somebody should do. And then, but they're very conservative. So they only earn 4%. They put everything in bonds. They like to be really careful, or a little bit afraid of the stock market, maybe. We look at somebody who contributes less. 15% is a good round number of your gross income to go in. Most advisors would say that's a very reasonable amount. More is better, certainly. And then we look at that person who starts early, invests aggressively, and gets a good return on that, and see how they turn out. My students do the math, and if you look at these, take a look at those and just guess in your own mind who you expect would be best. I think that answer is a little bit obvious. Everybody, I think the way I've set this up, I've kind of given you some ideas there. But that early aggressive, that person who starts at age 23, invests aggressively, puts in 15%, earns 8% on that until they're 70, and puts it away and only pulls out 4%, would be able to pull out $135,000 every year and leave the rest of it untouched. And so the question to ask is, could you live wherever you live? To be in Nebraska, I assume. Could you live on $135,870? Probably. And it gets a little harder to guess who's next when you look at these other ones, but start and stop actually comes in second. That's the person who saves aggressively when they're young for 20 years and then stops. So that is a better alternative than too little, which is a person who doesn't invest enough. They would end up with $72,000. The person who invests too conservatively, who doesn't put anything in the stock market, ends up with 4% return. They come in a third. And then that person who starts late ends up dead last. And that's the point of this. That's what I hope you'll think about, no matter what age you are. If you haven't started, today's the time to start. And look at the difference of magnitude between that start late and that early aggressive person. It's a huge, huge difference by the time you get to retirement. Number 8, the secret to getting rich is really boring. I tell my students on the first day of class that I'll tell them later about getting rich, and they all look excited. And then I tell them, and they don't look excited anymore. The secret to getting rich is simply to spend less than you make and do that for a long, long time. It's that simple. The big scary thing in your retirement years, the thing that's often under-recognized, although it's been in the news a lot lately, the big thing that you should be afraid of in your retirement is inflation. Inflation is insidious. Inflation eats away your spending power. And when you think about it, really what money is about is spending power. And that gets eroded dramatically by inflation. So if you retire at age 60 and pay $3.49 for a gallon of milk, which is about where we are here in Champaign, Urbana today, and you live until another 30 years, and we have 4% inflation, which isn't considered that high, your last gallon of milk will cost you $11.32. And the same thing with gas, and the cost to heat your home, and every other single expense. So it isn't about dollars per se, it's about spending power. That's what we need to accumulate. Just a wonderful tool that makes things easy for you sometimes, that rule 72. If you divide the 72 by the compound rate, it tells you how long it takes something to double. So with 4% inflation, you could divide that, or if you wanted to know how long it would take a farm to double in value or something like that. A few thoughts about estate and succession planning. You do need professionals involved in this process, but Warren Buffett is quoted as saying, "Never ask a barber if you need a haircut." I think that's pretty obvious. The answer will always be yes. And the same is true. And I encourage you to talk to multiple professionals as you think about your retirement planning and your financial planning in general. So if you ask an attorney, what do I need to do for estate planning? It's very likely they'll tell you they need a trust and they can set that up for you. And if you ask an insurance professional, what do I need to do for retirement? They're likely to say, well, you need some insurance products, and they can set that up for you. So to talk to more than one professional, see what they say, compare and contrast. It's also important that every 2 or 3 years, when you have major life events such as birth, deaths, divorce, adoption, that kind of thing, that you re-examine all your financials. And there's some things we don't want to think about that I think it's important as we get to the end of this presentation to think about some of the end of type things. You need to have a will, absolutely critical, especially if you got kids. I don't know about how you feel in the state of Nebraska, but here in Illinois, I would not want the state of Illinois to decide who gets my kids if I have not, although my kids are long since grown. A living will, which expresses your end of life wishes. I hope you're never in a situation, as I was about 1.5 years ago, where you're the person on the living will and you're the person who has to make those decisions. I did that when my sister passed and was very grateful that she had done that we had discussed it, that I knew what she wanted, I knew what she didn't want. And when the time came, it was a horrible decision. And at the same time, I was overwhelmed with gratitude that she had made that easier for me by making those decisions ahead of time and discussing it with me. You need a power of attorney for healthcare. What happens if you're disabled? If you were to be for some health accident or a stroke, that kind of thing, you can't make decisions on your own. Who do you want to make those decisions for you? You also need a power of attorney for your farm business. If something were to happen to you, if you were in the hospital for 3 weeks and couldn't communicate, for example, who's going to make decisions? Who's going to write checks? What if lease signing comes up? What if there's something needs to be done at the FSA office? That kind of thing. Also, a release of medical information. You should talk to your healthcare provider and find out about that. You might assume that you could go to your doctor's office and find out about your spouse, your child, your parent, but in some cases, that's not the case at all. The provider that I used, and my dad used, when he was still around, he was kind of getting confused and told me he'd been to the doctor, and the doctor changed his medicine and couldn't remember what the change was. So I said to Dad, do you care if I ask? He said, no, they wouldn't tell me anything at all. And then he signed a piece of paper, and then they would tell me anything I wanted to know. So you need to find out about that because that may become important at some point. A letter of last instructions. The members of my family, fortunately, have been really good about this. My dad and mother both, at a very early age, sat down and wrote down what they wanted in terms of burial or cremation or services, all that kind of thing. And when the time came, and the example of my dad at least, it made things a lot easier for my brother and sister and I at what was otherwise a very difficult time. And we didn't have to make any decisions. We knew exactly what Dad wanted in terms of a service and all that kind of thing. So enormously helpful, a gift that you could leave to those who come after you. It's also important now more than ever to have some kind of instructions or guidance on your digital assets, and especially for people to even know that you have an account. So I strongly encourage that. In my opinion, maybe the safest way to keep passwords, et cetera, is maybe the old-fashioned way, write them on a piece of paper and put them in the safe deposit box up at the bank. After you pass, your executor, and after they go through a little bit of court procedures, will be able to get access to that lockbox, and we'll be able to find out what to do about that. And lastly, a permanent file. I have a file that's called the permanent file because I am not permanent. And my son, who is my executor, knows where it is. And it's in my case, because I'm old and I like paper files, it's just a paper file and has some general instructions on where to begin, accounts that I have, where to find things, who the attorney I worked with is, all that kind of thing. It's important also to realize that there's something that people don't do in the order we expect, and that's part of the reason that all this estate planning and end of life planning is so important. And it's that people don't die in the order that we expect. We also always just kind of assume that the older people will pass first, and unfortunately that isn't always the case. And so that's why you need help from professionals that have experienced this kind of thing to do planning in order to address the issues that come up with that. My friend, Dr. David Cole, also often talks about a game he does with, not a game, but a simulation and exercise that he does with farm groups. This actually comes from military. He puts the farm family together around a table and then randomly picks one person and say, okay, if that person is no longer living, what are the rest of you going to do? And they have to talk it out. And the interesting thing that he points out that happens in every single case is the dead guy always wants to talk, but he doesn't let them do that. So to think about every member of this operation, if they were suddenly not here, how would this operation go on? What would we do? I think it's important that you assemble a team, just like and hopefully they are communicate well and work well together, just like those 5 pilots do there. At a minimum, I think you should have your banker, your attorney, your accountant, and hopefully all of those persons are a trusted resource to you. People that you could ask advice, people whom you're very confident that they will keep your information confidential, people who can benchmark, people who work with other farm operations that are similar to yours can, without naming names, of course, tell you this is what generally works, this is what sometimes doesn't work, this is what we see, those kind of thing. And if you're not happy with your banker, your attorney, or your accountant, get another one. The world is full of banks, the world is full of attorneys, and the world is full of accountants. You have lots of choices out there. If they aren't a trusted resource, if you don't think of them as a member of your team, then I think you should consider finding somebody that you will regard as a member of your team. Also, sometimes I think maybe you need a Tom Hagen. That's actually a reference to the Godfather movie. I hope everybody here knows what that movie is. Sometimes I think I date myself when I use movie names to college students, because sometimes they look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. Or better, I'll say it alternately, find your Bob. And what I mean by that, one of the things that sticks out, I was fortunate to have parents who were very business oriented, very business savvy, talked about business explicitly with my brother and sister and I from a very early age. And my dad's best friend ran the local department store back when small towns had the department store, and it was like Walmart and the internet all in one. It's an amazing place for a small boy. You could get tennis shoes and toys and toothpaste, and my mom could buy clothes, and it seemed like they had everything. And he was a really good businessman, and my dad was an excellent farmer, an excellent business person. And I would sit at the kitchen table sometime, just listen to the two of them talk. And they both benefited from the fact that they were both good at what they did. They both understood their businesses very well, but their businesses were very different. And they both learned things from each other. If you were to cultivate a relationship with someone who successfully operates a non-farm business and share your information with them, and they would share their information with you, there would be lessons learned. It's generally advantage of farms, in my opinion, to learn more about how non-farm businesses operate. And you might be able to get some good perspective on your farm operation from somebody, particularly because they're not a farmer as well. In terms of that team, I think it's enormously important to think about how you communicate with that team, that you give them a voice and that they feel comfortable speaking truth to power, as the expression goes. So the right time to ask them what they think about something is before you made a decision. And it's enormously important that you couch the question that way. So if you were part of my team and I say to you, and I'm the principal, so to speak, and I say, I've decided to buy a grain bin, what do you think about that? The answer that some team members will give is different. After it's obvious that I've already made a decision, I want to move ahead with this. They might give a different answer than if I say, what do you think about building a grain bin? So it's really important to be careful how you phrase things. And then after you do, to listen wholeheartedly. And the point of that, and I always point out that listening is an extraordinarily important business skill. If you listen long enough, you'll hear what you need. And I also like to point out to 20-year-olds that you were given 2 ears and 1 mouth. And often the most learning comes when you're using the ear part. But those advisors, you want them to be the canary in the coal mine. You want to look for that moment where the attorney or the banker or accountant says, I don't know if that's a great idea or not. You should be watching for those little red flags and then try and investigate, figure out what it is that makes my banker nervous about this, even though my accountant or my attorney thinks it's a good idea. And lastly, I think it's important to never, ever forget that #1 goal when it comes to farming. I use this line in this slide over and over with lots and lots of farm audiences. The #1 goal is to be here to play this game again next year. And especially as we go through this inflection point, we go into some leaner times, we go into a point in time where people could be maybe a little bit overextended. If we come out of some pretty good years, we might tend to think that maybe that's going to go on forever. And so to think about that and never forget that we want to be here next year. So to make a baseball analogy, it's more important to think about hitting singles or doubles than it is to be looking for home runs and grand slams. And just a parting thought about finance. The more I feel enormously blessed by the fact that my parents were both very forthright about talking about business, and we discussed business at the dinner table explicitly. And sometimes I listen to my parents complain about what the electric bill was, or dad didn't like the interest rate he had to pay when he bought a tractor, or those kind of things. But this is a tremendous gift to give to your kids. And because sociological changes, we don't sit around the dinner table probably as much as we did back in my day. And money feels like plastic to many kids. It doesn't feel like that green money that I used to want to get from walking beans or baling hay so that I could buy a model car or whatever. And so the more you can help your kids learn about finance, I think they will be so happy later on. And then the more you can get them involved, get them a little skin in the game, even if that means occasionally losing a little bit of money. So like many of you, when I was a kid, I fed steers and I fed them and watered them and took care of them. And then when we sold them, I got some money and felt like I was rich. And it was a great way to learn about business. And my parents charged me a little bit of money for the use of the barn, a little bit of money for the pasture, and a little bit of money for vet supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So I learned how all that works. But the more you can get your kids involved in finance and the more you can teach them about your business, the better they will be situated to help and become part of it and eventually take over someday when that time comes. There's my email address, and I like to practice PowerPoint tricks because the current generation of students, you got to keep things moving or they won't pay attention. So here's my latest PowerPoint trick. There we go. Awesome. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to respond to those. Let's just see.
Paul, it looks like we have one question.
Okay.
What are the disadvantages and advantages of including grandchildren in this conversation with the intention of passing land to them instead of children?
I think depending on your specific situation, obviously this is something you want to talk to attorneys about. I think that's a great plan. I think particularly educating them from an early age will help them understand the possibilities that were there. And then certainly as one way of making sure the land stays in the family, passing, so in my family, for example, of course, this was many years ago, but my grandfather left some land to his grandchildren with a life estate in grandma, and then a life estate in his and grandma's kids. So he actually jumped it down a couple of generations, assured that it stayed in the family, made everybody interested in it. So there are a lot of possibilities there. I absolutely love the idea of involving grandchildren and helping them to understand the financial side of it and what it takes, the good and the bad. There are a lot of wonderful things about farming, but there are some things that, you know, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of risk. It's being on a financial roller coaster sometimes. There are sometimes, you know, issues between family members that have to be worked out, that kind of thing. But I think that's a wonderful thing to do. And then part of that becomes to being sure that the generation that gets skipped over, so to speak, understands that. And then also recognize that the owner of the life estate, even though they get the income, they get the control, there's something that they can't do. So they can't sell it, obviously, but that might dramatically limit their ability to borrow money and use that land. So we're talking about land or buildings, use that land as security. So great question, great thing to be thinking about. And I'm all in favor of getting more than one generation after my own involved in the conversation.
It's like we've got another question. When is the right time to think about philanthropy as part of farm financial planning? First of all, I think I love philanthropy, and I think the first consideration is to think of it as a philanthropic consideration, and I wouldn't do it just for that reason, but I think some of that early on. And then I also think that's a great thing also to be sure that kids understand. And
do on a regular basis. So I have a certain amount of money every month goes to a charity that I think is a good one. And to start that from a early age. In terms of the tax benefits, those are less great than they were, unless you're talking really large amounts of money. But certainly, I think that's a great thing to consider early on.
Thank you. Anybody else, if you've got a question, go ahead and throw it in the question and answer little conversation bubble. You can find that towards the middle on the bottom of your screen. We'll maybe wait just a moment to see if anybody else has a question. And it looks like everybody's questions are answered. But like it shows up there on the screen, you can reach Paul at his email there with further questions later.
Yes.
And thank you for your time today, Paul.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. I'd be happy to, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to talk to you that way if you're so inclined. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope we get to meet in person sometime too.
Yes, thank you, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining us. I just put in the chat the website where you can find a recording of this webinar, cap.unl.edu, and you can also register for all of our upcoming webinars at that website. You will also get a recording and the handouts, just the handouts emailed to you after the session. We would also appreciate your feedback on the brief evaluation that should pop up when you exit Zoom. This just really helps inform future webinars. So we just appreciate everybody's time investing in something very important, not only your farm, but your family. And we hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you.